From Bloomberg's Washington Bureau to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Emily Watkins on Capitol Hill on day 2 of the Senate trial of President Trump. Sean Don here with me in Washington on President Trump's new trade focus on Europe. And from Milan, Gerald Colton on Luigi Di Maio stepping down as the head of the Five-Star Party. So, Emily, bring us up to speed on where things are. As I understand, all the motions, nobody made any motions, so we're going to actually start with the thing today?
Yes, today, in just about an hour's time, we are going to start seeing the House impeachment managers begin to make their case why the Senate should remove President Donald Trump from office. Yesterday was all about process, exactly how this trial is going to work. And today we start to see them actually make the case. They have 24 hours to use over the next 3 days. And I think there's a lot of people in this building who are hoping that we're not going to be here as late as we were last night.
Well, but it's over 3 days rather than 2, so that was a compromise from the majority leader, Mitch McConnell. Whom are we going to hear from? First of all, on the Democrat side, is it all going to be Adam Schiff?
I don't expect it to be all Adam Schiff. You saw yesterday Schiff make opening and closing remarks, but you also got to see all of the other 6 impeachment managers take some time and make some comments. I mean, all of them have been chosen for very specific reasons, based on their background, based on their experience levels. And so I imagine that all of them will take a turn at the podium today to help make the case against Donald Trump.
Yeah, one of those managers we heard from actually last night was Jerry Nadler, and he got into something like a skirmish with Pat Cipollone, the chief counsel for the president, and it actually required the chief justice to intercede and say, gentlemen, let's calm down.
Yes, around, I think it was 1 a.m. in the morning. I mean, remember, this is a very unique experience for many of these senators. Usually senators don't spend a lot of time in the chamber. They're not sitting there for hours and hours on end. And so there is a bit of an adjustment period into figuring out sort of how this is going to work, what tone is going to be set. Adam Schiff used some language on the floor yesterday that I think a couple people were debating whether or not it was appropriate. It was totally allowed, but yesterday, yes, you did see them sort of come down and say, hey, when it comes to partisan bickering, that needs to be limited.
Okay, Emily, thank you so much. That's Emily Wilkins reporting once again from Capitol Hill. And now let's turn to Sean Donnan right here with me in Washington. He is our resident trade expert. We heard from President Trump this morning in this news conference, and a fair amount of it actually was about trade, and specifically about European trade.
Yeah, so Europe is the great unfinished piece in Donald Trump's trade agenda. He has wanted for a few years to kind of rebalance things with the U.S., with the EU. There is a big trade deficit with the EU. A lot of it focused on cars, and Trump hatched this idea a couple of years ago to level auto tariffs at European imports to try and force Europe to the table. Well, over the last couple of days in Davos, he's doubled down on that idea again. He's doing it with a new European Commission and a new European Commission president in Ursula von der Leyen, and trying the whole thing all over again. The big question, of course, is after 2 years of trying this approach, whether it'll generate a big deal or the sort of deal that he can crow about going into the election.
As I recall, we were on the brink, and there sort of was a truce that pulled us back from it. He has in his back pocket the autos, but one of the issues is agriculture, because as we know, the Europeans jealously guard their agriculture.
Absolutely. So in July 2018, Jean-Claude Juncker, the then European Commission president, came over here to Washington to try and stop these auto tariffs from going ahead. And they hatched what became known as the Rose Garden Truce, which basically allowed negotiations on some industrial tariffs and some regulatory issues to go ahead, and for the U.S. to hold off on these auto tariffs. But that quickly kind of ground to a halt because the Europeans thought they had an agreement from the Trump administration not to include agriculture in any talks. The French in particular are very opposed to some of the issues that the U.S. would raise in any agriculture talks. And Congress intervened and said, we're not going to have any negotiations with Europe unless agriculture is hatched. What I'm told is the Europeans may be finding a bit of a way around this in talking about some regulatory issues with agriculture in a new round of negotiations, but whether this will work, again, is a big question.
That's the French in agriculture. What about the French in digital tax? Because as I understand it, the EU basically said individual member states can go their own way. Mr. Macron stepped up right away, and that really got the president's attention.
Absolutely. And so the president before Christmas threatened to impose tariffs on French champagne, French cookware, French cheese, going as high as 100% tariff on some of those things if the French went ahead with this digital services tax or didn't didn't unilaterally disarm on it. The French have refused to do that. They say they will keep this tax in place as long as there is no multilateral agreement on tax. There are some negotiations going on at the OECD.
Well, those have been going on for a while. What are the prospects of an OECD deal, really?
Well, that's a huge question. But what the U.S. and France have agreed to this week in Davos, and we saw it with Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron earlier this week in a phone call, and today again with the French finance minister and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin agreeing to kind of step up those negotiations towards a multilateral deal, and the French agreeing that they're kind of forego the next tranche of payments due on this digital tax. Again, the Trump administration claiming that tariffs have forced the French to cave a little bit and engage in another negotiation. But whether that negotiation is going to go anywhere is a real big question.
So President Trump's news conference this morning was remarkable, not just for his focus on Europe, but also he shared the stage with Roberto Azevedo, who is the head of the WTO, saying, here's Roberto, we're really friends now, we're going to reform the WTO. Is this a big move on WTO's part? Because this has, again, been something the president has really been fixated on.
Absolutely. So the president for a long time has talked about the WTO as one of the worst trade agreements ever created, of course, created in the 1990s as a result of the Uruguay round of negotiations that the U.S. actually led at the time. Roberto Azevedo is in that kind of thankless place of having to mediate Donald Trump and the rest of the world, who are the WTO's members, and try and find a path towards reform. He briefed the president today on the state of those discussions. My understanding is they're not going anywhere real fast, but the president grabbed him, pulled him on stage, and really wants to take ownership of that. Again, another negotiation. We're going to have to see where this goes.
Another negotiation. He's the art of the deal. Okay. Thanks very much to Sean Donnan, our resident trade expert here in Washington. And now we're going to go to Italy and Gerald Colton. He is over in Milan, and there's big developments over there. We have Luigi Di Maio stepping down as the head of his party. What's going on? Why now, Gerald?
Well, you're probably familiar with Luigi Di Maio if you follow Italian politics. He's basically the face of the five-star movement, one of the key parties here in Italy. The support for the party, both internally and externally, has been hemorrhaging over recent months. The poll numbers are quite poor. Support has been slipping from inside. In fact, some lawmakers have even left the party, some even going to the opposition. And even more importantly, the poll figures for coming regional election this weekend look very, very poor indeed for Five Star. So really, somebody has to take the fall for this, and it's going to be Di Maio.
So, Gerald, what does this mean for the coalition?
Well, initially today, the markets appeared concerned that this might mean the coalition could fall apart. We could see snappy elections. We could see even a victory for Matteo Salvini's League party. I think that on second thought, the coalition is made up of a couple parties that really need each other. Five Star is weakened, as I said. The other party in the coalition, the Democrats, are not strong enough to take on the League themselves. I think neither of these parties really, it's in neither of these parties' interest to face a national election. So I think that they're going to stick together. They're going to try to find a way to forge ahead, even though they're really, frankly, two groups that don't like each other very much.
So, Gerald, finally, if the Five Star is losing support, as they have been for some time, is it going to one place? Where are those supporters going?
That's a very good question. A lot of that support is going to the League, in fact. The League's numbers have grown as Five Star's figures have fallen. And that's the main concern for both parties, really, is how strong the League is now. It's stronger than when Salvini pulled out of the government this summer.
Okay, thank you so much to Gerald Colton. He's reporting today from Milan. And now it's time to get a check on how the markets are reacting to today's top stories. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle in New York. So, Abigail, I'm not sure it's what we've talked about so far. Is it we're not as concerned about that virus coming from Wuhan?
That's probably the bigger influence today, David, because the bulls are back in charge. Yesterday was a tad risk off on concerns around that deadly virus. But today, as you can see, lots of green on the screen. Record highs here in the U.S. for the major averages, including the S&P 500, the NASDAQ. You can see the NASDAQ really outperforming up 0.5%. That is due to tech being the best sector on the day. And behind that tech strength, take a look at the stocks. So the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index really outperforming, up 1.5%. This before Texas Instruments reports tonight, kicking off the chips reporting in this particular earnings season, an all-time high there for the stocks. But one interesting divergence down for a third day in a row now, David, is the Dow Transports. However, certainly not down. Take a look at Tesla over the last 2 days. This morning, right on the open, crossing that $100 billion market cap milestone. These shares now up an extraordinary more than 200% since the lows last spring. And again, over the last 2 days, up more than 15%. On the year, up more than 40%. It's really pretty incredible. So the bulls there on Tesla really very much in charge. As for other big drivers on the day, it's really earnings. If we take a look at some of the movers here, we see IBM up about 3%. They put up a rare sales beat, the first time in 6 quarters where sales actually grew. Profits also beat. That may have to do with the Red Hat acquisition. Cloud really very strong for them. Netflix, on the other hand, down 2%. The U.S. subscribers, that was a miss, putting up 420 new U.S. subscribers versus the estimate of 600,000. International subscribers beat, but valuation very high, price for perfection. Shares certainly not acting perfectly. And if you can believe it, David, the last time those shares put an all-time high all the way back in June of 2018, that stock really has its work cut out for itself. Johnson & Johnson, a disappointing quarter, down 1.1%. And then, as I was mentioning, after the bell, the reporting season for the chips will be kicked off by Texas Instruments. Right now, pretty strong performance. Hopefully, their results will be as strong. Lots of expectations that the sector is bottoming out. We'll need more proof through the earnings, and we'll start to see that tonight, David, with Texas Instruments reporting.
Thanks so much to Abigail Dula. We're going to come back to Johnson & Johnson in just a minute. But first, let's turn to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, in Davos, Switzerland, President Trump today lashed out at his accusers in the Senate impeachment trial. He called the trial bad for the country. Still, Mr. Trump broke with some of his Republican defenders. He says he would like witnesses to be called. Democrats are likely to begin presenting their case against the president today. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he'd be happy to testify in the impeachment trial if he's forced by law to do so. But Pompeo also told reporters traveling with him in Kingston, Jamaica, that he's not following the trial. Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli will have an interview with Secretary Pompeo coming up in the next hour on Bloomberg Television and radio. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin is downplaying talk that trade discussions with China will be wrapped up by this November's presidential election. Speaking at a panel at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Secretary Mnuchin said there's no deadline to the Phase 2 negotiations with China. Under a Phase 1 agreement signed by both nations last week, some sanctions on China will be eased, and Beijing will step up its purchases of American goods. China is ramping up efforts to contain a respiratory virus that's killed 17 people and infected hundreds. Hong Kong has now reported its first case of the illness, and there's been one diagnosis here in the United States. The fear is the disease could spread in China when hundreds of millions of people travel during the Lunar New Year holiday. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. In New York, I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David, back to you in Washington.
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, Johnson & Johnson reported its fourth quarter earnings this morning. Its chief financial officer, he's Joseph Wolk, is here to take us through those earnings. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Johnson & Johnson reported its fourth quarter earnings this morning, with sales up year over year, but missing analysts' estimates, which took some off the share price. We welcome now from New Brunswick, New Jersey, Joseph Wolk. He is Johnson & Johnson Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer. So, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us. So let's start out with the big question, which is the analysts got it wrong. Why? Did you underperform or did they overestimate?
David, I would thanks for having me here today. We're very pleased with the results, not just for the fourth quarter, but for the entire year. With respect to the investment community, we're talking on $20 billion for the quarter, about a $30 million disconnect. We can point to some one-time events, specifically in our medical device unit, where we had some elevated sales in Q3. So I wouldn't say anybody got it wrong. I think it's just solid performance across all three of our segments.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, but it looks like really oncology and immunology helped drive these numbers. And I know that Alex Gorski specifically called them out, how well they're doing. Yes. How much are they driving your results? And are you at all concerned about biosimilars and generics eating into that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, David. In terms of oncology and immunology, we've got great scientists there that for better than a decade now have been bringing just transformative medicines in immunology, specifically around psoriasis, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. So we point to products like Tremfya in psoriasis. I think it grew 55% year on year comparatively versus the fourth quarter of 2018. That continues to show best-in-class data. It was the first IL-23 out there. With Stelara, we're addressing patient needs for Crohn's disease. It's a debilitating disease that has tremendous uptake, but actually had its start as a product with psoriasis. So we continue to expand that portfolio with oncology. Imbruvica and Darzalex continue to perform extremely well, moving into front lines of therapy, so more patients are getting treated earlier, and we know that's the best diagnosis in terms of, or prognosis for better outcomes. With Darzalex, we're particularly excited about a subcutaneous formulation that we hope to get approved sometime around the first half of this year. That will take the infusion time of 6 hours down to about 5 to 10 minutes for patients, and we think that's just a big advancement for patient convenience.
Yeah. All really good news for Johnson & Johnson and for its shareholders. But what about the biosimilars? What about the generics? Are they on the horizon? Do you see any threat coming up in the future to some of that leading in immunology and oncology?
So we have had actually an impact from biosimilars this year. It was about $2 billion incremental to what we experienced in 2018. So we've been dealing with biosimilars for a few years. We had a number of products that faced loss of exclusivity. So we had biosimilar and generic competition. So David, the great results of 5.8% growth that you see from our pharmaceutical unit was in spite of a $2 billion headwind. So we have dealt with it. We will continue to deal with it. It's an important part of the system. As we come up with new transformational medicines, we want to make sure, as all good healthcare companies do, that there's room for those to be available for patients. And so having generics and biosimilars as part of the equation in terms of overall healthcare costs is an important part.
As CFO of Johnson & Johnson, I know, Mr. Wolk, you are always looking at your portfolio, what you want to add, what you want to take away. As I understand, you referred to possible deletions of underperforming businesses today in the earnings call. Do you have any nominees? And just as important, perhaps, because I suspect you're going to say, I'm not going to name any companies or any lines of business. How will you judge that? Is that margin? Is that operating profit? How do you judge whether it's underperforming?
Yep. So we look really with a mindset of being number one or number two in the markets in which we play. So do we have that level of innovation, that level of execution that ensures that we are well positioned within the markets? And if we're not there currently, we want to make sure we've got a real good game plan. When those plans don't come to fruition, and sometimes they don't, we'll look to see if we can create value for shareholders by doing something else with that asset. Similarly, though, we look to add where we can. We can complement our business. About 40% of our growth over the last decade has come from inorganic opportunities.
And finally, Mr. Wolk, talk about the donut hole, the so-called donut hole Medicare. We hear about this a lot, which, as I understand, is narrowing, and that's costing companies like Johnson & Johnson some money. Can you put any numbers around that? How much is it costing you?
Yeah, I won't put any specific numbers around it, David. What I can talk about is pricing in general, and we understand why that is a topic of conversation for the past couple of years, and certainly as we head into an election year here in the U.S. Overall pricing for Johnson & Johnson's products over the last 3 years, have declined. And the average on that is about 4%. So that's not a cumulative number. That's 4% each and every year for the last 3 years. We know the White House of Economic Advisors came out with a report recently, said that pharmaceutical pricing has declined in its most recent study. We need to get more of those discounts that are being generated for insurers and governments into the hands of the patients who need them most. people are walking into their pharmacies on a monthly basis paying $50, $75 for a copay when they used to pay $5 and $10. We need to make sure that that's addressed so that these great medicines that are coming, not just from Johnson & Johnson, but across the industry, are available to patients most in need.
You mentioned drug pricing overall. In your projections going to 2020 and beyond, are you putting anything in your numbers for possible legislation on Capitol Hill? Because a lot of people are talking about something maybe even this year.
Yeah, we see continued pricing pressure. As I mentioned, with Johnson & Johnson in the industry, we have seen price reductions over the last number of years. We continue to see that trend. It usually is around some of the more competitive spaces. If you think about diabetes drugs, if you think about psoriasis drugs, where there's a lot of competition, just as a free market economy should work, you're going to see price negotiation a little bit more intense.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being with us today. That's Joseph Wolk. He's Johnson & Johnson Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer. Still ahead, Boeing is struggling, which means that its suppliers are not far behind. Aerospace company Arconic is in the crosshairs, and it's our stock of the hour today. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. Time now for our stock of the hour. Arconic is one of the worst performers in the S&P 500 today. The stock is sinking nearly 3% after it was downgraded by Longbow because of the Boeing 737 MAX. Kaylee Lyons is here with more. So I think we can blame almost everything at this point on the Boeing 737 MAX. But well, here's one more, Kaylee.
At least for today, yes, this may be all of Boeing's fault. The analyst over at Longbow Research, his name's Chris Olin, downgraded the stock to underperform from neutral because of the impact of Boeing. Of course, we had Boeing saying yesterday that it doesn't see the 737 MAX returning to service until mid-year, around June. That's another 3-month delay. The FAA, for its part, saying that it actually has no timetable, so that could potentially get delayed even further. And Longbow sees this could have a really meaningful impact on Arconic's top line, especially, he says, that it could bring earnings per share down to around $2 a share and knock potentially $400 to $500 million off of commercial aircraft revenue. The reason why it's such a big impact, David, is because Boeing is one of Arconic's top customers. Actually, it's second largest in terms of revenue, with about 8.3% of the revenue share. And we know that Boeing has stopped production for the time being of its Boeing 737 MAX, which could be a significant hit to Arconic's top line here.
So I understand there was a spin-off in the works. What does this do to that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. The spin-off, what is going to stay in the business is Howmet, which is its aerospace division. The company is planning on spinning off what will keep the Arconic name. That's that global aluminum rolled business. And that is much lower in terms of profitability, lower margin, only about 9% in the latest quarter, whereas the aerospace business margin was above 20%. So they're trying to focus more in that area. That was seen as a possible catalyst for valuation, considering that it is higher margin. But Longbow noting that timetable may get pushed back because of the 737 MAX, David.
Okay, Kaylee, thank you so very much. That's Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons reporting from New York. Up next, House Republicans are heading for the charge for the impeachment of President Trump. We're going to talk with one of the people who was a Republican from Louisiana when he was in the House. When he led the charge, he is Bob Livingston of Louisiana. This is Bloomberg. From Washington, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton in New York.
David, the stage is set for House impeachment managers to begin making their case against President Trump. According to rules approved by the Senate early today, they'll have 24 hours over 3 days to make arguments. The president's defense team will get equal time. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says he'd be happy to testify at the impeachment trial if he's forced to do so by law. Secretary Pompeo also says he'll travel to Ukraine, quote, before too long. He tells Bloomberg that Ukraine sits at the edge between democracy and tyranny. Pompeo also accused Iran of spreading a destabilization cancer around the globe. Bloomberg's chief Washington correspondent Kevin Cirilli will have an interview with Secretary Pompeo coming up in the next hour on Bloomberg Television and Radio. President Trump is hinting that sanctions on Iraq are still a possibility. Mr. Trump met with Iraq's president in Davos, Switzerland today on the sidelines of the annual World Economic Forum. It was the first meeting between the two since a U.S. drone strike on Iraqi soil killed a top Iranian general. When asked whether his administration was still considering sanctions on Iraq, President Trump said, quote, "We'll see what happens because we have to do things on our terms," end quote. United Nations experts are calling for an investigation into allegations that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was involved in hacking the cell phone of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos. Officials say information now suggests that Bezos' phone was hacked following a WhatsApp exchange with the Crown Prince. Saudi Arabia's finance minister spoke exclusively with Bloomberg in Davos.
I think the embassy in Washington, Saudi embassy in Washington, issued a statement last night or early this morning saying clearly that this is absurd. They called for an open investigation so that people know what happened.
A report by United Nations experts says the alleged hack may have been an effort to influence or even silence the reporting of the Washington Post, which Bezos owns. The Saudis were blamed for murdering Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Is abuse of power an impeachable offense?
Well, you're going to talk to the lawyers about it, but I will tell you, there's nothing here. I had a very innocent conversation with a very fine gentleman from the Ukraine, and it was based on that.
That was President Trump addressing questions about his impeachment in Davos earlier today. Welcome now Bob Livingston, who has his own experience with proceedings like these, serving as Republican congressman from Louisiana and for a time as Speaker of the House of Representatives when it was William Jefferson Clinton who was the target. So, Mr. Speaker, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much, David. Good to be here.
Let me pick up on that question specifically. Do you believe it can be, put aside the facts of this particular case, can it be an impeachable offense to abuse your power when you're President of the United States?
I think that the charge of abuse of power is so vague and so widespread that any president of the United States could have been brought up on that charge. In this case, I think it's just really baseless because it deals with a Ukrainian call, the transcript of which everybody has. Everybody can judge for themselves. And frankly, I've looked at it as a former prosecutor. I don't see any abuse of power. When we dealt with President Clinton 21 years ago, there were some firm crimes. There was obstruction of justice. There was perjury, subornation of perjury. And the fact is that President Clinton had testified under oath, and he'd lied. And there were people in prison at the time, both in the military and in the civilian corps, who had done exactly the same thing under exactly the same circumstances, but they were in jail. So when you contrast that you could justify that as an abuse of power or a crime. In this case, I don't see a crime at all.
So fair enough. There's a clear distinction between, on the one hand, the Clinton impeachment, on the other hand, the Trump administration impeachment, in the fact that they did not allege a crime in these two articles of impeachment. On the other hand, in the case of William Jefferson Clinton, while there were crimes alleged, in effect, ultimately he lost his bar membership as a practical matter for perjury. There was no accusation that what he did, the wrongdoing he did, was misusing his office in order to continue himself in office, which under the, as you know, the Federalist Papers, that's exactly what impeachment was going to. Is there a situation, put aside again the facts of this case, where a President of the United States could ask a foreign power to help him continue in office that would be impeachable?
Well, in this case, the president didn't really do that, did he? He asked the president of Ukraine to help us unlock some corruption and to discover corruption, whether the Bidens were involved or anything else. Ukraine was notably one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And as it affected the United States, we were giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine, something that, frankly, wasn't done under the Obama administration. But we were giving them that money, and in order to put ties on the money, he wanted to make sure that it was being spent correctly. You could say say, the Democrats have said that's an abuse of power. I personally don't see it. But again, it depends on which party in the House of Representatives is in control. And they could virtually call any president in the history of the country guilty of abuse of power.
And also, as we're seeing, which party is in control in the Senate as well. It goes both ways. And I want to go to exactly that point because, of course, President Trump is on trial in some sense in this proceeding. Also, I wonder if our entire system of government is on trial. That is to say, the American people are watching it. And if you look back in 1999, when there was the trial of President Clinton, and you look today, it's almost as if people are saying exactly the same things, just switching depending on whether they have an R or a D after their name.
I think many of the arguments are identical, without a doubt. In fact, many of the speeches are identical, except they're being said by somebody else. So you're absolutely right. But again, I have to contrast the underlying foundation of these charges. And in this case, I'm sorry, there's no crime alleged. Back then, there were specific crimes alleged. And when the founders drafted the Constitution, basically, they were saying it's high crimes, misdemeanors, and then they specified bribery or treason. Now, you don't have any of that. In fact, the Democrats have been charging this president since the day he got elected and saying that they wanted impeachment. They had spent 2 years on a foolish goose hunt for collusion with Russia. That came to nowhere. There's been this Ukrainian thing. There was the firing of Comey. There were the firing of some of these other people. All of those were within the power of the President of the United States, and they could be interpreted in any way the majority wanted them to be.
So as a former member of the House of Representatives and a former Speaker of the House, are you concerned that we are lowering the bar on impeachment overall? That we'll just have an impeachment almost with every president now? It's almost a political tool that you turn to.
David, I think that's a danger. Look, there were a lot of people that thought Bill Clinton should never have been impeached. They said it was basically about sex.
By the way, President Trump said that today in his news conference. He said Clinton should never have been impeached.
Well, I was on the other side of that, so I guess I have to disagree with him. But the fact is that there were real crimes. Now there are no crimes, and so you have to ask yourself, well, if we're going to use this one as a bar, yes, every president from now on could be impeached.
Okay. I really appreciate you being with us today, Mr. Speaker. That is Bob Livingston of the Livingston Group, founding partner. He's former Congressman of Louisiana and former Speaker of the House of Representatives. Coming up, President Trump shared the podium with the head of the WTO today as they both called for reform in the International Trade Organization. We talk with former Deputy Director General of the WTO, Rufus Yerxa. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, people have talked for years about reforms in the World Trade Organization, but now it looks like maybe something might just get done, as President Trump made it a priority in his news conference in Davos today, where he was joined by Roberto Azevedo, the WTO head.
Talking about a whole new structure for the deal, or we'll have to do something, but the World Trade Organization's been very unfair to the United States for many, many years.
We welcome now Rufus Yerxa. He is former Deputy Director General of the WTO and former Deputy United States Trade Representative. Ambassador Yerxa is now President of the National Foreign Trade Council here in Washington. Welcome, Rufus. Good to be with you in Washington. So give us your sense of what's going on. As I say, Roberto Azevedo was up there. He introduced him. He made a few remarks. Is there a rapprochement or coming together now of the United States to the WTO?
Well, look, I think President Trump still is very skeptical of the WTO. He hasn't been a big fan of trade agreements generally and multilateralism. He doesn't like to see things that are going to restrict his power to, start tariff fights and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, he seems to be acknowledging that the WTO is there and that the U.S. wants to engage in it. We'll have to see how that relationship goes. Obviously, there will still be a lot of tension between the big players. You see the fights going on between Trump and the Europeans now, and of course, the China tensions will continue. Well, those are the countries you have to make a deal with if you want to reform the WTO. So it's not going to be easy.
But as a student of the WTO, the United States has sort of cut off a lot of their funding and really threatened them with budgets. Have they got their attention? Is it possible that will shake something loose and have some reforms? Because you've said in the past there's room for reform of the WTO.
There's always room for reform, and in fact, there's a reform program that's been going on for a couple of years. There's been very robust talks on digital trade, for example, on how to update the rules of the WTO for the digital economy, which were agreed to back in Buenos Aires at the last WTO ministerial. But the question now is, first of all, he has threatened to cut off funding. They didn't actually cut it off. The U.S. only pays about 13% of the WTO's budget. So remember, this is an organization with 160-plus countries. It's not easy for the U.S. to dictate all the rules there. We've got to engage in negotiation. There is room for maneuver now, and particularly if the U.S., the Europeans, the Japanese, and others can work on things like subsidies. There needs to be better reform of the subsidy rules in the WTO to deal with a mixed economy like China.
Well, you have the subsidies in China, a mixed economy without a doubt. Can you deal with that with China? Because the Europeans have said they really want to help us on that, work with us on that, without dealing with things like the common agricultural policy in Europe. I mean, some would say that there's a form of subsidy going on right now in Europe. By the way, you could say that about our own agricultural program.
Yeah, well, look, the U.S. and Europe have been fighting about agricultural subsidies for a long time. We've actually made progress. In fact, Azevedo got an agreement back in Nairobi, a couple of ministerials passed, where he strengthened the subsidy rules on agriculture. So there's been some progress on agriculture, including between the U.S. and Europe. I think they're capable of dealing with each other in the WTO on that. The bigger question is, how do you develop an alliance of countries to push China in the right direction? The problem I've seen all along is that the U.S. wants China to change, but we're busy starting trade fights with the Europeans and with our best allies in the WTO system. And, you know, Trump has to change his tune there. He has to start working with these countries, showing some leadership. If he expands the trade war with Europe, for example, by putting tariffs on autos, it's going to be very hard to get cooperation with the Europeans on how to deal with China in the WTO.
Address, if you can, briefly, one specific issue, which is the digital tax. Because you talk about digital trade with WTO. We also have the OECD looking at this.
Right.
What's the proper body to resolve that problem?
So, you know, there's always this issue of what does WTO deal with? It deals with trade. And then what do organizations like OECD deal with? They deal with tax. And what's the intersection between taxation and trade rules? And certainly a digital services tax raises all kinds of issues about whether you're guaranteeing foreign companies national treatment. That is the same treatment you give to your own companies. The big fight we have with the French now is they've created a digital services tax that seems to focus only on big American companies and exempts a lot of French companies. And that becomes a fight in the WTO if we can't resolve it. But there is work going on in the OECD to try to get an agreement.
Yeah, as I say, it's not lost on President Trump how it would affect U.S. digital companies.
No, exactly. And, you know, he's shaking things up. The real question is, will people trust him to do deals that rely on good faith implementation by all members? That's the issue. It's an issue of trust more than anything.
Okay. Thank you so much to Rufus Yerxa. He's National Foreign Trade Council President, and we're going to be having more with him coming up next in the next hour on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Bloomberg Chief Washington Correspondent Kevin Cirilli has been traveling with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Kevin just spoke to the Secretary in an exclusive interview from Jamaica. Kevin started by asking Secretary Pompeo about Iran-backed Hezbollah finding a foothold in South America.
When you see the scope and reach of what the Islamic Republic of Iran regime has done, can't forget they tried to kill someone in the United States of America. They've conducted assassination campaigns in Europe. This is a global phenomenon. When we say that Iran is the leading destabilizing force in the Middle East and throughout the world. It's because of this terror activity that they have now spread as a cancer all across the globe.
This past week, as you've traveled the world, we started in Germany and Berlin, where you met with world leaders, including German Chancellor Angela Merkel. I'm sure you talked about Iran, but as you know, Europe has not always followed the same strategic route as the United States when it comes to Iran. Did your meetings with European leaders move the needle in that direction at all?
Yes, sir. Look, we've been clear. We've had a different view on the right way to proceed to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, that their missile program is contained, and that this terror regime we were just talking about is pushed back. They've never wavered from the shared objective. They've just had a different view about how to proceed. But if you've seen what Iran has done even in the past few weeks, right, that's nuclear extortion. They're now threatening to leave the NPT. So I did. I talked with my European counterparts while I was there. They have now taken a step under the JCPOA to invoke the dispute resolution mechanism. I think not only they, but the world can now see that this rogue regime has no intention of complying with the central tenets of what that agreement contained, and the world must unite to ensure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. I saw President Macron say that yesterday. I know he means it now. We need to work together to achieve it.
So when you say they have no intention, then how do you get Tehran to go to the United Nations, to come to the United Nations, to work with the international community aside from the sanctions and the various military response options?
Ultimately, the people of Iran will get what they so richly deserve, a regime that behaves in ways that are consistent with the value sets of the Iranian people. In the end, the Iranian people will demand their government. You see it. You see it in the protests. You see it when they walk around American flags that were put down by the Islamic Republic's leadership in an attempt to show they could show pictures of Iranian people walking over American flags. And in fact, people go out of their way not to do that. This isn't about Iran versus the United States. This is about a regime that has treated its own people terribly. The world can see it. It's a regime that even now the IAEA is trying to figure out how nuclear material got to places that the Iranian leadership said it would not be. And so this is a global risk. President Trump started his remarks the night after an American response by saying Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. It is our primary purpose. But we have a broader set of objectives too. We just want them to behave like a normal nation and re-enter the society, the community of nations.
And traveling with you all week, I mean, I'm struck by just the range of the hotspot issues around the world that are going on. And back home, the only thing that they're talking about is impeachment and the Senate impeachment trial. Did that come up at all in your conversations with world leaders? And has the Senate impeachment trial endangered U.S. interests and reputation around the world?
You know, Kevin, it hasn't come up today, except where I received a question at a press conference about it, so it came up.
And you said you would testify.
I've said consistently, if the law required me to testify, I would do so. You know, it hasn't come up. It almost never comes up in meetings with my counterparts. There's too many important things going on in the world. America is too close a partner to have with countries in the Caribbean region here in Kingston. They care about so much that we do. They're such good friends and allies. They see the noise in Washington, but it is not something they would think in the time that we have between us that they would raise.
And House Democrats are saying that Rudy Giuliani orchestrated a shadow foreign policy. And can you assure diplomats serving overseas all around the world in dangerous places that that's not the case?
Yeah, the foreign policy we were executing then is the same foreign policy we're executing today with respect to Ukraine. It's an important country. It sits at this crossroads. It's under enormous pressure from Russia. President Trump has taken actions to counter Russia that President Obama refused to take. We've provided defensive systems for the Ukrainian people so that they can defend themselves. We've supported this new leader, President Zelensky, in his efforts to stamp out corruption and to build his democracy. We're continuing to do that. Our policy with respect to Ukraine has been set on the fundamental principles of reducing the footprint of corruption and helping the Ukrainian people build up a democracy while under threat from the Russians in the east and southeast.
You've said that you look forward to going there, that you have other issues that you want to discuss with them. Or is that still the case?
Yeah, I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there before too long. I had a trip planned, and then we had an issue arise in the Middle East that I had to attend to. While that issue is not behind us, there's still a lot of work to do there. I'll get to Ukraine before too long.
To take a step back, why should Americans care about what happens in the Ukraine? What's the broader theme here? Who's explaining to the American people why U.S.-Ukraine policy matters to the average American?
Yeah. So Ukraine sits at the edge between democracy and tyranny in the easternmost parts of Europe. It's a nation that gave up its nuclear weapons at the end of the Cold War, and America made a commitment that said we would assist them with a number of things so that they could still be a secure, sovereign nation. We care about democracy everywhere. They're a huge trading partner for the United States of America. America has a number of interests with respect to Ukraine, and I think the level of resources we've committed there reflects that level of interest.
That was part of Kevin Sterling's exclusive interview with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And Kevin joins us now from Kingston, Jamaica. So, first of all, well done, Kevin. A timely interview. Let's go back to where you started about Iran and the relationship with Iran. It's clear the Secretary is steadfast in saying they cannot get nuclear weapons. He says Europe is there as well. But I don't hear how they're going to keep them from getting them. It doesn't seem to be progress to have them pull out of the JCPOA.
It's absolutely correct, and I was struck by Secretary Pompeo's continued assertions about the growing threat of Hezbollah in Latin America, and that precisely is part of the reason he traveled here and really trying to unify support not just around Venezuela President Juan Guaido, but also against broader national security themes. As it relates to Europe, Secretary Pompeo and the United States also very much trying to firm up strategy with the Europeans to get them on the same page with the United States and to get Iran to somehow negotiate with the United Nations. Now, we should note that within the past 24 hours, Tehran has said that that is something that they are not willing to do, especially should Europe continue to use the United Nations and to continue to try to work with the United Nations to have that go on. I also asked him, of course, about the Senate impeachment trial. He says it has not come up. I can tell you that the impeachment has been on the front pages of virtually every stop along our way on this 5 countries, 5 tour, but he says largely it's business as usual.
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, Kevin Sterling, terrific job. He's in Kingston, Jamaica right now. Coming up, we are just moments away from the start of the opening statements in President Trump's impeachment trial. We're going to be bringing you some of the opening statements on TV and on radio. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television, and we are on Bloomberg Radio.